At Branham's memorial service in 1966, held during a full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International Convention, Osborne publicly declared this belief to a room filled with charismatic leaders. He did not speak in metaphor. Osborne said plainly that God came again in human flesh in Branham. What is most telling is not merely the statement, but the absence of public objection. No correction was issued, no clarification was demanded. None of the leaders of the emerging charismatic movement refuted the claim. Among Branham's circle, the idea that he had been a divine vessel, even deity incarnate, had been quietly accepted or at least passively affirmed. This reverence became a template for future prophetic leaders. Branham had claimed divine visitation, altered his biography, contradicted himself regularly, and yet was treated as untouchable. His legacy was not just a theology of signs and wonders, it was the creation of a spiritual aristocracy immune to scrutiny. That legacy would live on in the rising apostolic and prophetic networks that emerged from movements like shepherding and the FGBMFI. The shepherding movement, led by Derek Prince, Bob Mumford, Charles Simpson, and Don Basham, introduced formal language for these dynamics: submission to authority, covering, and discipleship. But the blueprint was already there in Branham's ministry: his angelic commission, his stage-managed revelations, and his insistence that revelation trumped institutions. What Branham modeled, others formalized. These networks redefined authority in the charismatic world. No longer did accountability flow through denominational structures or shared doctrinal standards. It now flowed through relationships, revelation, and rank, from apostles to prophets, from prophets to the people. And it was built on the unspoken assumption that a new breed of leaders had emerged, anointed by God to govern the church with direct insight from heaven. Though William Branham is best known for prophecy and healing, one of his most enduring and dangerous theological innovations was his doctrine of the spoken word. For Branham, words were not merely expressive, they were creative. When uttered with faith, they could change reality itself. He told stories of speaking squirrels into existence and even commanding the dead to rise, not by prayer, but by verbal decree. These were not rare exceptions, but part of a growing theology. Faith-filled speech activated divine power. This doctrine became central to his healing revivals. Attendees were not only encouraged to believe for healing, they were told to confess it out loud, to declare themselves healed as proof of faith. To admit symptoms was to admit unbelief. As a result, thousands claimed healings that never occurred, pressured by spiritual suggestion and social expectation. Many later died of the very illnesses they had spoken away, but the revival had already moved on. It was T.L. Osborne, Branham's disciple and global evangelist, who first popularized this theology on the international stage. Through massive crusades in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Osborne preached that healing, salvation, and breakthrough could be claimed through spoken faith. His widely distributed materials taught believers to declare their healing, confess victory, and speak change into existence, echoing Branham's spoken word model, though with smoother delivery and broader appeal. But it was Kenneth Hagin who would later give this belief systematic form. Though Hagin claimed to receive his teachings through divine revelation, many of his core doctrines, including faith confessions, revelation knowledge, and words as containers of power, had already been modeled by Branham and disseminated by Osborne. Hagin took those charismatic intuitions and organized them into a repeatable theology, giving birth to what would become known as the Word of Faith movement. Later leaders like Kenneth Copeland, Fred Price, and Creflo Dollar would take these principles to global television audiences, turning Branham's stage theology into a lifestyle gospel. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship International played a key role in spreading these teachings. In hotel ballrooms and convention halls, businessmen turned preachers taught one another how to speak prosperity into existence, declare financial breakthrough, and claim supernatural healing, all using the same basic formula pioneered under Branham's tent. The supernatural was no longer about waiting on God, it was about activating results through the right words. Branham had once stood alone on the platform, speaking things into existence as a man of power. Now, an entire movement had been trained to imitate him. not just his claims, but his methods. The theology of dominion by declaration had arrived, and it wasn't going away. By the 1980s, William Branham's name had faded from public memory, but his ministry model, emotional spectacle, prophetic mystery, and supernatural power, was quietly being reborn. A new movement, dubbed the Third Wave, began spreading through charismatic circles. No longer confined to revival tents, this iteration came through house churches, informal worship, and contemporary music. But while the packaging had changed, the DNA had not. At the heart of the Third Wave was the belief that God was restoring supernatural power to everyday believers, a message first modeled by Branham, now rebranded for a new generation. At the center of this movement was John Wimber, founder of the Vineyard Church. Originally mentored by Chuck Smith of Calvary Chapel, Wimber inherited more than church growth strategies. He absorbed Smith's early openness to latter-rain ideals, including the expectation of end-time revival, widespread supernatural healing, and personal prophetic guidance. Though Calvary Chapel would later distance itself from such extremes, Smith's early flirtation with the healing revival stream left a lasting mark on Wimber's theology. Wimber's trajectory was further shaped by Lonnie Frisbee, the flamboyant evangelist often called the hippie preacher of the Jesus movement. During the early 1970s, Frisbee lived in Fort Lauderdale, where he was personally discipled by Don Basham, one of the founders of the emerging shepherding movement. Living in an apartment provided by shepherding leaders, Frisbee was exposed to the core teachings on spiritual authority, submission to covering, impartation through personal touch, and hierarchical relationships. Though Frisbee's mystic, nonconformist approach often clashed with their rigid discipline, and he would later drift from strict shepherding structures, the movement's imprint remained deep, especially in his belief that the anointing could be transmitted directly through prophetic figures. When Frisbee laid hands on Wimber's congregation in 1980, triggering mass spiritual manifestations, shaking, falling, speaking in tongues, it was not merely a spontaneous outpouring, it was the practical outworking of shepherding impartation theology fused with Branham-style supernaturalism.